What if I told you that the most powerful city of the ancient world, with the greatest navy, unimaginable wealth, and a fleet that controlled the Mediterranean, was obliterated so completely that even its name would eventually fade into obscurity, lost forever, as if it never existed at all? Before we dive into one of the most dramatic battles for power in the ancient world, take a moment to subscribe, like, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss out on the twists, the shocking truths, and the historical revelations that are about to unfold. This story isn't just about war, it's about the birth and fall of empires, and you'll want to stay with us as we unravel it all. Let's begin this journey together. It was 146 BC, and Carthage, a city that had once ruled the seas, was about to meet its brutal end. For over 5 centuries, this city, built by refugees fleeing royal betrayal, had thrived on cunning, trade, and strategic alliances. Nestled along the North African coast, it was a maritime empire so powerful that even the mighty Roman Republic dared not underestimate it, until it was too late. But how could a city that had survived so much, that had engineered the art of warfare, been brought to its knees? What happened to the Carthaginian Empire, a civilization that had mastered the seas and the art of commerce, yet failed to foresee its own destruction? You think you know the story, right? Rome versus Carthage. The Punic Wars, the rise of Hannibal, the glory of battle. You know the headlines, but not the full story. What if I told you that the reason Carthage fell wasn't because of a superior Roman army or a final crushing defeat on the battlefield? What if I told you that the real cause of Carthage's fall came from within? The empire's internal struggles, betrayals, and the very trait that made it great, its obsession with mercenaries. Yes, mercenaries. The very warriors who fought for Carthage turned on her, abandoning her in her greatest moment of need. But it doesn't stop there. Carthage's last gasp came in the form of a betrayal that not even its most brilliant general, Hannibal Barca, could have predicted. After his legendary victories, after his campaign that nearly shattered Rome, Carthage still lost. But it wasn't a lack of leadership or tactics that doomed her. It was her over-reliance on mercenaries, who were fickle and motivated only by gold, not loyalty. And this treacherous army, along with the political system that couldn't rally together, paved the way for the Romans to execute one of the most shocking and brutal military strategies ever seen. After Rome crushed her forces, they didn't just burn Carthage to the ground, they wiped out its very identity. The streets were salted to prevent any hope of resurrection. A whole culture, an empire, eradicated by sheer, calculated force. When the dust settled, what was left of Carthage? Not a single piece of its vast wealth, no remnants of its advanced naval tactics, not even the smallest shard of the technology that once made it an empire. The Romans ensured that Carthage's name would not be spoken again for centuries. They rebuilt their own city on top of it, but it wasn't Carthage they resurrected. It was Roman Carthage, a shadow of what once was. The true story of Carthage's demise isn't what you read in your history books. It's a tale of arrogance, betrayal, and a stubborn failure to adapt. Carthage didn't fall because it was conquered. It fell because it could not see the writing on the wall. And what's truly chilling? The same political and military miscalculations that brought Carthage down can still be seen in empires today. The city that once ruled the Mediterranean, an empire so vast it could touch every corner of the known world, was reduced to rubble in a mere 3 years. Not by military might, but by the fatal flaw of its own ambition. Carthage didn't fall because of an invasion. Carthage destroyed itself. Think of Carthage and what comes to mind? Its legendary wealth, its superior navy, its unconquerable harbor? These things didn't just define Carthage. They fooled everyone, including Carthage itself. In reality, the empire was more fragile than anyone ever realized. It wasn't the Romans who caused the downfall, it was Carthage's own heart that betrayed it. It all started with a woman named Dido, born Alyssa, exiled from her own homeland. She was not the romanticized queen of legend but a survivor, desperate for vengeance after her brother's treacherous murder of her husband. Dido fled Tyre not to find a new home but to escape death. And in that flight, she didn't just found Carthage, she set the stage for its ultimate demise. The myth tells us she cleverly used an ox hide to negotiate land. But the reality is darker and far more compelling. Dido was forced to use a trick that would expose Carthage's greatest weakness. A reliance on cunning, not strength, to claim what was rightfully hers. And this wasn't a diplomatic gesture, it was survival. She needed a place, any place, to build her empire, and her negotiations were born out of desperation. Carthage's strategic location was perfect. Positioned on the shores of North Africa, it could dominate Mediterranean trade. But what was its greatest strength, the ability to connect the world, was also its greatest weakness. Carthage was an empire built on trade, not loyalty. Its citizens were merchants first, soldiers only when necessary. This would come back to haunt them. When war came, Carthage relied on mercenaries, not out of choice but out of necessity. The Romans knew this, and they knew that Carthage's mercenary army was its biggest vulnerability. No loyalty. No true fighting spirit. When the war dragged on, these hired soldiers didn't just grow tired, they switched sides. But the true betrayal would come not from the Romans, but from Carthage's own people. Asterisk. You've been told Carthage was brought down by Rome's armies. But that's not the full story. Carthage didn't just lose the war, it self-destructed. Internal corruption ran so deep that by the time the Romans crossed into Africa, the city was already teetering on the edge of collapse. Carthage's empire wasn't destroyed by battle, it was destroyed by the greed of its rulers, the betrayal of its soldiers, and the fractured political system that never saw the cracks until it was too late. The Roman Republic knew Carthage could not be defeated with brute force alone. The secret to Carthage's destruction lay in Rome's ability to wait, to exploit the flaws in the Carthaginian system. And when it did come, the final blow wasn't just the loss of a battle, it was a grinding attrition of everything Carthage had ever relied on. The Romans didn't just sack Carthage, they erased it from existence. The city's magnificent walls, built to withstand any siege, fell within weeks. Its docks, once the center of the Mediterranean economy, were filled with rubble. But why? Why destroy what was once an unstoppable force? Because Carthage's fall was always going to be more than military defeat. It was the exposure of its weakness as a society, a system that had built itself on fleeting power and hollow ambition. When Rome finally destroyed Carthage, it wasn't just an empire that fell, it was a way of life. The wealth, the ships, the art of trade, all of it wiped out. But what's the real cost of empire? What's lost when a civilization builds its greatness on mercenaries and trade, but not on loyalty or unity? Carthage's rise was built on ambition. But its fall came because ambition can't save a people when it turns inward. The greatest empires of history, do they rise or fall because of their strength? Or because they've forgotten the one thing that matters most? The strength to protect what truly matters? But even in its destruction, Carthage left a mark. A shadow in the Mediterranean, a question that echoes through time. And Rome, having destroyed Carthage, would soon face its own moment of reckoning. The city that dominated the Mediterranean, a beacon of wealth, naval supremacy and unchallenged power, was erased from the map in less than 3 years. But it wasn't Rome's legions that did it. Carthage didn't fall because of invasion. It fell because it created the conditions for its own annihilation. What we've been told is only half the story. The truth? It's darker than even the Romans could have imagined. The year is 814 BC. A queen, Alyssa, known as Dido, fleeing from the bloodied grasp of her brother Pygmalion, sails westward with nothing but a few loyal followers and a burning desire for revenge. It's a story of survival, but it's also the beginning of something monstrous. From humble origins, Carthage rises, not from conquest but from cunning, exploiting a system of trade, loyalty, and cruelty that would eventually implode under its own weight. But here's what you don't know. The birth of Carthage wasn't just a tragedy of love lost. It was a calculated escape. Dido, like the city she founded, was not simply a victim. She was the architect of an empire, one built on deceit and a refusal to bow to the status quo. Carthage's foundation wasn't just about finding land, it was about creating a base for survival, a safe haven in the storm. And survival, as history would soon reveal, always comes with a price. Carthage wasn't just another Phoenician outpost, it was the greatest commercial empire ever conceived. By becoming the hub of the Mediterranean trade network. Carthage wasn't content being a minor player. It quickly turned itself into the beating heart of a global trade web, sending ships across uncharted waters to secure goods from every corner of the ancient world. But there's a twist. The genius behind Carthage's prosperity wasn't just in its trading routes. It was in its merciless efficiency. In the beginning, Carthage's merchants did something that no other power had the audacity to do. They cornered the market. Rather than building direct empires or waging endless wars, they built systems, economic systems, that bled competitors dry without lifting a single sword. They dominated the Mediterranean by ensuring that no one else had a viable route to power. Carthage's rise wasn't about war, it was about controlling everything by controlling the flow of wealth. The myth of Carthage's greatness is simple. They were the greatest merchants the world had ever seen. But this lie is dangerously misleading. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Carthage's real power wasn't its ships. It was its ability to manipulate and exploit every ally, every land, and every trader it encountered. From the beginning, Carthage made a dangerous trade-off. It sold its soul for the illusion of stability. Wealth flowed in, but it wasn't wealth that sustained Carthage. It was the promise of more wealth, and in doing so, it alienated everyone who worked for it. Trade. Yes. But also betrayal. Every colony they founded wasn't just a trading post. It was a new base for exploitation. Every alliance wasn't for mutual benefit. It was a calculated step in expanding their web of influence by any means necessary. And when a city thrives on manipulation, there's always a moment when it all unravels. And that moment? It was fast approaching. As Carthage expanded, so too did its network. By the 6th century BC, Carthage's trading empire spanned from the coasts of Britain to the shores of Africa. They had achieved something no empire before them had: total economic domination. Yet, the key to Carthage's expansion wasn't just in its ships. It was in its unrelenting ability to manipulate weaker powers into submission. They didn't just create trade networks, they exploited them to the fullest extent. But with every new conquest, Carthage grew more fragile. Its political system, an oligarchy dominated by merchant families, was far from secure. The trade deals that built Carthage's wealth created powerful enemies just as often as they created allies. The question wasn't whether Carthage could survive, it was whether its own merciless system could sustain it. The seeds of betrayal were sown, and they were only a matter of time before they sprouted. Carthage's success in trade and its cultural boom should have made it an empire for the ages. Wealth flowed, the city's art, culture, and military technology blossomed. But here's where it gets unsettling. None of this would have been possible if the city hadn't been built on a lie. Carthage's wealth came at the expense of its soul. While its elite merchant families were growing richer by the day, they were blind to the growing discontent within their mercenary armies, their client states, and their very political system. And when the time came to defend their wealth, they were left with nothing but their own corruption. Here's the crux of the matter. Carthage's greatest strength, its ability to control trade, was its downfall. The elites became more obsessed with wealth than the survival of their people. The mercenaries Carthage relied on grew disillusioned, refusing to fight for a city that had no loyalty to them. In the end, Rome didn't defeat Carthage, they exposed it. Rome's greatest victory wasn't just military, it was political. They exploited Carthage's internal dysfunction, watching as the very empire that once dominated the Mediterranean bled itself dry from the inside out. Carthage didn't just fall, it destroyed itself. From the inside out it rotted. The final blow? The betrayal of its mercenary armies and the self-interested decisions of its elite families. Rome may have delivered the fatal strike, but Carthage's collapse had been inevitable long before that. What happens when the empire is built on ambition and greed instead of loyalty and unity? Carthage was a warning to all future empires. When Carthage burned, it wasn't just its wealth that was lost. It was a world built on the belief that empire could thrive without loyalty, that ambition could sustain what trade and conquest could not. Carthage's fall was a lesson, not just for empires of the past, but for all empires. What happens when you mistake wealth for security? What happens when your empire's very foundation, built on exploitation and manipulation, inevitably leads to your undoing? Carthage didn't just fall because of Rome, it fell because of itself. But what happens when an empire built on survival and ambition is born again from the ashes? What if Carthage's story isn't truly over, but waiting for someone else to take its place? Imagine the world's most powerful empire, its navy unrivaled, its merchants the richest in the known world, falling not because of its enemies but because of its own arrogance. Carthage was a city of legend, an empire born on cunning, wealth, and commerce. But hidden beneath the shine of gold and the ripple of sails lay the rot that would bring it all crashing down. Carthage didn't fail because of external forces, it failed because of the lies it told itself. And when it fell, it wasn't just destroyed, it erased itself from history. The year is 500 BC, and the Mediterranean is a fragmented world, with Greece emerging as the intellectual and military power, and Rome still a mere speck on the map. But in the far west, a new power rises, Carthage. By this time, Carthage wasn't just another Phoenician outpost, it was a growing commercial empire, controlling the seas with a fleet so vast that no power dared challenge it. Its wealth flowed from trade, its power from ships, and its influence spread across the Mediterranean like a shadow. But this empire wasn't built on military conquest. In fact, Carthage's greatest strength, its navy and economic prowess, became its greatest weakness. A strange paradox. The stronger Carthage's navy became, the more vulnerable it was to destruction. The Carthaginian fleet was unstoppable. Ships crafted from the finest cedars, skilled navigators, and advanced war tactics made them masters of the Mediterranean waves. But here's the shocking truth. Their navy's success became a mirage, a false promise of invulnerability. While they could command the seas, they couldn't command the land. Unlike the Romans, whose legions were disciplined and built to last on land, Carthage's military might was nothing more than a collection of mercenaries, hired soldiers with no loyalty to the empire. Carthage's army was not a united force. It was an assembly of contractual soldiers paid to fight, but only for as long as the money held out. And when that money ran dry, they abandoned their posts. At the heart of Carthage's empire was a merchant oligarchy. The wealthiest families ruled with a firm grip, not by military might, but by control over trade and wealth. The political system was a strange mix of power and paralysis. 2 annually elected magistrates, the Sophites at the top, with a council of elders, and the infamous 104, a tribunal of elites pulling the strings. Carthage's power came from wealth, but as it grew wealthier, the cracks in the system deepened. These merchant families cared about one thing: trade. They lived in a world where every decision was made based on profit, not survival. They were businessmen, not statesmen. And this was the fatal flaw. When power is concentrated in the hands of men whose only goal is profit, when loyalty to the empire is weaker than loyalty to personal wealth, the empire is already doomed. But Carthage didn't know that yet. Its navy sailed, its coffers overflowed, and it seemed as if the empire would never end. The merchants saw themselves as untouchable, and the more they earned, the more dangerous they became. But what happens when an empire built on greed is tested by its greatest enemy? Internal collapse. The moment of reckoning is coming, but what the Carthaginians didn't know was that their greatest enemy wasn't an external power, it was themselves. The biggest lie Carthage told itself was simple: their wealth and maritime supremacy were enough to secure their future. This lie made them blind to the reality unfolding on their shores. They believed that as long as they controlled the sea, they could control everything. But what happens when you neglect the land? What happens when you focus all your energy on building a world on shifting sands? Carthage built a fragile empire, a fortress of ships, wealth, and mercenaries, but it had no foundation. It was only a matter of time before the cracks showed, and when they did, they wouldn't just break. They would shatter the empire to pieces. Carthage's fall wasn't caused by Rome, it was caused by Carthage's inability to adapt. When the pressure of war came, Carthage's system couldn't hold up. The merchant oligarchs, fixated on wealth, had created a system that failed to prioritize loyalty or unity. When Rome waged war, Carthage's armies were too fragmented to defend the empire effectively. Mercenaries, once loyal to Carthage, now turned against them. The once great navy was now an empty shell. The devastating truth? The Carthaginian elite, consumed by their own greed and short-sightedness, never realized they had already lost. The enemy was never Rome, it was the Carthaginian system itself. Carthage's political infighting and militaristic failure reached their apex when the Romans, led by Scipio Africanus, finally entered the fray. But the destruction of Carthage was never just about Roman conquest. It was the exposure of Carthage's failings. The Romans didn't defeat Carthage. They exposed how broken Carthage had become, how a rich empire could destroy itself from within, all because of a failure to understand the true nature of power. Carthage's rise and fall isn't just a story of naval supremacy, it's a warning. What happens when an empire becomes addicted to wealth and ignores the very people who serve it? What happens when profit is prioritized over loyalty, military strength, and unity? The collapse of Carthage shows us that no matter how great an empire is, it will fall if its foundation is built on greed. Empires built on manipulation and corruption may rise quickly, but they always collapse just as fast. But while Carthage was burning, another empire was already learning from its mistakes. And soon, it would set its sights on the very world Carthage had ruled. Could Rome, an empire born of war and ambition, repeat Carthage's mistakes? The answer would change the course of history forever. You think you know the story of Carthage? A great empire crushed by Rome's unstoppable legions. But what if the real reason Carthage fell wasn't military might? It was a lie so powerful that it shaped history itself. Imagine this. An empire built on the back of sea trade, mighty warships, and rich merchants, destroyed not by weapons but by propaganda. The truth is far darker than the story we've been told. The year is 500 BC, and the Mediterranean is a fractured world. Greece and Persia are locked in their eternal struggle. Rome is still a young republic, stretching its legs across the Italian peninsula. But amid this, Carthage stands, its navy unparalleled, its wealth unrivaled. The Phoenician colonies have spread, but Carthage is different. Unlike the empires that rose with iron and steel, Carthage's strength is rooted in its merchant class. Its fleet dominates the Mediterranean, weaving an empire not through conquest, but through trade and the control of sea lanes. And at the heart of Carthage's cultural identity are two ancient, powerful gods, Tanit and Baal-Hamon. Tanit, the goddess of fertility and the moon, represents creation. Baal-Hamon, the god of fire and destruction, represents the forces of nature that carve empires from nothing. Their worship binds the people of Carthage, not just in religion, but in a belief that their empire is divinely chosen to reign. But there is a dark side to this belief. Tanit's image is everywhere in Carthage. Her symbol, a simple yet elegant triangle topped by a horizontal line, was carved into statues, minted into coins, and displayed in every temple. Tanit represented the earth, the cycles of life, and the protection of Carthage from all harm. Beside her stood Baal-Hamon, whose fire could both destroy and purify. But the reality of their worship, particularly Baal-Hamon, was far more sinister than we're led to believe. The worship of Baal-Hamon wasn't just about fire, it was about sacrifice. Here is where the first shocking truth hits. The sacrifices made to Baal-Hamon, particularly during times of crisis, were far more than ceremonial rituals. They were driven by necessity, not cruelty. In a society where survival depended on trade and military conquest, sacrifices were seen as a necessary means to ensure prosperity and protection. But in the annals of history, these sacrifices were twisted. Greek and Roman writers recorded stories of children offered to Baal-Hamon in the flames, stories that would haunt Carthage for centuries. Here's where the real manipulation begins. For centuries, Rome and Greece sought to tarnish Carthage's image. Why? Because Carthage was everything they were not. Rome, emerging as a land-based power, needed a justification to eliminate the competition in the Mediterranean. And what better justification than the accusation of barbaric child sacrifice? The Roman propaganda machine didn't just destroy Carthage militarily, it painted a cultural portrait of a people driven by evil gods and horrific rituals. The child sacrifices? A story blown out of proportion to create a justification for war. But it was so effective that it became fact. Even today we call it one of the most grotesque parts of Carthaginian history. But is it the whole story? Or was it just the lie that the Romans told the world? So what happens when you demonize a culture so completely? What happens when a civilization's entire identity is rewritten by its conquerors? It's not just Carthage that gets destroyed, it's the memory of Carthage. The city, the religion, the people. The gods of Tanit and Baal Hamon, so central to Carthaginian identity, were erased in one fell swoop. What Carthage was, what it believed, vanished into the fire of Roman conquest. But as we look deeper, we begin to wonder, what was lost in that erasure? The consequences of this manipulation were far-reaching. For centuries, Carthage was viewed through the lens of Roman and Greek accusations. But what if those stories weren't the full picture? Carthage was not just an empire of sacrifice and blood, it was a commercial powerhouse, built by merchants who understood the world in ways the Romans couldn't comprehend. This wasn't a society of blind fanatics. These were people who believed in their gods, yes, but also in the power of wealth, trade, and diplomacy. They created an empire not through territory and conquest, but through connections and alliances. They were the masters of the Mediterranean, until they believed that wealth and naval power alone could protect them. The tragic irony? They believed that they could maintain their power through economic dominance without ever considering what would happen if they lost the loyalty of their people. As Rome swept through Carthage, it didn't just conquer the city, it destroyed a civilization. Carthage's gods, Tanit and Baal Hamon, became symbols of barbarism. But those gods represented a culture, a belief system that sought balance with nature, not blind obedience to a centralized power. The destruction of Carthage was not just physical, it was a cultural genocide, an erasure of what had made Carthage Carthage. In the end, the greatest casualty was not the burning of temples or the deaths in battle. It was the death of an identity, a civilization that had existed for centuries, now reduced to a few broken ruins and scattered myths. But the legacy of Carthage, even in ruins, did not die with its walls. Over time, what was once dismissed as barbarism would become the forgotten wisdom that would echo through the ages. How much of that wisdom did Rome really understand, and could they have built their empire without Carthage's influence? But the truth? Both sides see only themselves as the righteous party. Greece, with its moralistic ideas about democracy and freedom, sees Carthage as an oppressive empire. Carthage, with its complex network of mercenary armies and merchant oligarchs, sees the Greeks as mere upstarts attempting to steal away their prosperity. In truth, they're both right and both wrong. As these two giants move closer to war, we're left to ask, is it really about territory? Or is it something deeper, a battle for the very heart of the Mediterranean world? What is the cost of empires, of ideas that grow so large they lose sight of the human cost? The tension is palpable. Both sides know that control over Sicily means control over vital trade routes. For the Carthaginians, Sicily is the gateway to the Hellenistic East and beyond, their mercantile lifeblood. The Greeks, meanwhile, are building an empire on the back of Sicily's fertile lands and its strategic position as a crossroads between the West and East. Carthage's approach is swift and brutal. They send fleets to blockade key Greek colonies, but they underestimate how fiercely the Greeks will fight for their home. The Greek cities, aligned under the leadership of Dionysius of Syracuse, unite under the banner of freedom. But here's where the manipulation begins. Both sides declare they fight for noble reasons. The Greeks, We are fighting to protect our culture, our way of life. The Carthaginians, we are defending trade and peace, protecting prosperity for all. But the truth is far more disturbing. This battle is about empire, not freedom, not trade routes. Greece wants to control Sicily's wealth. Carthage wants to control the entire Mediterranean. The illusion of freedom and protection is the tool each side uses to justify violence, to veil their imperial ambitions. And as the war rages, they both turn their people into pawns, convincing them that the enemy is the villain. The true villain, though, is the same on both sides: greed. The war between Carthage and the Greek colonies isn't just fought on land, it's fought in the minds of the people. Both sides rely on their warriors, Greek hoplites and Carthaginian mercenaries, yet the real danger lies in their shared blindness to the cost of empire building. The Carthaginians send their mercenaries to war, men with no loyalty to the land they fight for, willing to turn on their masters for the highest bidder. The Greeks, for their part, are no better. Dionysius is not a liberator, he is a tyrant in his own right, ruling with iron fists over his own people. But these complexities are buried beneath layers of propaganda. Greeks as freedom fighters, Carthaginians as merchants of oppression. Both sides are so blinded by their righteousness that they can't see they're creating the very thing they sought to destroy, an empire where loyalty is fleeting and power is just a means to an end. The Battle of Himera, 480 BC. The Greek forces strike, rallying under their own banner of moral justice. Carthage, despite its superior numbers, is outmaneuvered. The Greeks, now emboldened, push back Carthage's forces, reclaiming vital territory. But in the aftermath, the victory is hollow. Carthage does not collapse. Instead, it learns and adapts. For Greece, this victory becomes an illusion. Sicily is still not safe. The Greeks might have won the battle, but they have not solved the deeper problem: the looming threat of Rome, a young power quietly growing in strength just across the waters. For Carthage, the consequence is even more profound. Its empire is crumbling from within. It cannot maintain its hold on Sicily without draining its treasury, and its people are starting to see the cracks in the empire's facade. When the war ends, the people of Carthage and Greece are left with the same truth. Empire, no matter who holds it, no matter what banner it flies under, comes at an unthinkable cost. The cities of Sicily, once lush with trade, now stand as barren reminders of the destruction wrought by both sides in the name of freedom and protection. The greater question here: what is the price of empire? And what happens when the very thing you fight to protect is destroyed by your own ambition? Both Carthage and the Greek colonies are left asking the same question, as they're haunted by the legacy of the war they fought. But as the Greeks rejoice in their victory and Carthage licks its wounds, a new threat looms just beyond the horizon. Rome, a rising power in the east, is beginning to look westward. The stage is set for the next phase of conflict. The battle for Sicily may have ended, but the battle for the Mediterranean is just beginning. The sun hung high over the Sicilian coast, but the Carthaginian fleet, undefeated for decades, was about to meet its greatest nightmare. What no one could have predicted was that this wasn't a battle for territory, it was a death sentence. The Battle of Himera wasn't just a loss for Carthage. It was the end of an empire's identity, one that had always thought itself invincible until it wasn't. The year is 480 BC. Carthage, the undisputed maritime giant of the western Mediterranean, has everything to lose. It controls the most lucrative trade routes, its fleets sail unchallenged across the sea, and its mercenary army strikes fear into its rivals. But beneath this veneer of invincibility lies a fatal flaw, a hubris so deep it could not see its own collapse. The Greeks, led by the cunning and ruthless Dionysius I of Syracuse, have united against Carthage's expansion. Dionysius, despite the internal chaos of his own city, has galvanized the fractured Greek colonies into a formidable force. But Carthage, under the command of the experienced Hamilcar, dismisses them as nothing more than disorganized resistance. What happens next isn't just about military strategy, it's about belief. Both sides believe their cause is just, their victory assured. But the truth, as always, is far more complicated. The Carthaginian forces, expecting a swift victory, march on Himera. They are met with a Greek alliance that refuses to back down. The Greeks know their survival depends on this battle. The Carthaginians, on the other hand, believe their superiority is enough to win the day. But there's one thing Carthage doesn't account for: resolve. The Greeks fight not for glory but for existence. The Carthaginian mercenaries, motivated only by pay, have no such stake in the outcome. As the battle rages, the unthinkable happens. The Greeks outmaneuver the Carthaginian forces, forcing a retreat. Carthage's once indomitable army crumbles. The mercenaries scatter, and Hamilcar's defeat is complete. But it's not just the loss on the battlefield that destroys Carthage. It's what it reveals about the empire's rot. The Carthaginian system is built on a lie, that wealth and power alone can sustain an empire. But when war requires loyalty and not just gold, Carthage is exposed as hollow. For centuries, Carthage had believed its wealth made it untouchable. It was a society ruled by merchant aristocrats, whose entire political system depended on exploitation. Mercenaries fought their wars, not citizens. Carthage didn't need loyalty. They thought they could buy everything, even victory. But this defeat exposed the fatal flaw. The Carthaginian military, which had once relied on mercenaries, could no longer trust its own soldiers. This was not a defeat of men, it was the failure of a system. The Battle of Himera leaves Carthage reeling. Hamilcar's defeat shakes the foundation of Carthaginian confidence. The empire, shaken to its core, begins to realize that it cannot continue on the path it's chosen. The reliance on mercenaries, the assumption that wealth can win wars, these myths must be dismantled. Carthage embarks on the painful process of rebuilding its military system. No longer will they depend on mercenaries. Instead, they will train and recruit soldiers who have a stake in the empire's survival. But as they rebuild, they are unaware of the growing threat on the horizon. Rome, quiet, calculating, and deadly, has been watching, learning from Carthage's mistakes. Carthage's efforts to rebuild aren't just defensive, they're doomed. The lesson from Himera is not just military, it's human. Without loyalty, no empire can survive. The defeat at Himera shows that empire is more than just land, gold, or soldiers. It's about trust. Carthage, built on exploitation and military expedience, is no longer invincible. They relied on mercenaries, but mercenaries have no loyalty. Carthage had everything to lose, and in their arrogance they lost it all. The philosophical gut punch. Empires are not destroyed by enemies, they destroy themselves from within. Carthage's defeat wasn't just military, it was existential. And as the empire crumbles, it is forced to confront the truth. What is an empire if it has no heart to protect? As Carthage reels from the loss and Rome watches from the shadows, one question remains: can Carthage rise from the ashes of its own arrogance? Or has it already built the foundation for its final fall? What happens next will shake the Mediterranean world to its core. The year is 550 BC. The great city-state of Carthage stands as the wealthiest empire in the Mediterranean, a beacon of maritime dominance. From the coast of Africa to the shores of Spain, Carthage controls the seas, its fleets carrying precious goods, slaves, and weapons to every corner of the known world. But what few know is that this empire is built on a dangerous foundation: mercenaries. Unlike other empires, which rely on their own citizens to fight their wars, Carthage turns to outsiders to protect its vast riches. Iberians, Numidians, Greeks, Celtic tribes, they all fight for Carthage but not for loyalty. They fight for gold. The Carthaginian elite, distant and disconnected from the lives of their soldiers, believe they can buy their victories. But what they don't realize is that they are paying for their own destruction. Carthage's reliance on mercenaries seems like a practical solution at first. Mercenaries are skilled warriors, trained, brutal, and efficient. They help Carthage expand its empire and secure its wealth. But there's a hidden cost to this method. Mercenaries are not loyal. Their allegiance is to their pay, not to a cause. By the time Carthage faces the First Punic War, its reliance on mercenaries has reached a critical mass. The military is divided not by national pride but by personal gain. The soldiers of Carthage fight for money, not for their city or its gods. Carthage believes wealth and power will keep its empire intact. But as history has shown time and again, you cannot buy loyalty. The true test of Carthage's military system comes when the gold runs out. After the First Punic War, Carthage is in debt. Unable to pay its mercenaries, it faces a revolt. The Mercenary War, 241 to 238 BC, erupts in a catastrophic conflict that turns Carthage's own forces against it. The mercenaries, once loyal to gold, now fight for revenge. What Carthage thought was a reliable fighting force becomes its greatest enemy. The Carthaginian government is forced to fight a civil war, but this is more than just a military defeat, it's a moral collapse. The truth begins to surface. Carthage's empire has been built on mercenaries, but those same mercenaries have no true loyalty. Carthage's reliance on gold to fuel its wars has blinded the elites to a fundamental truth. Empires are not built by mercenaries. The mercenary war exposes this flaw, and the consequences are devastating. The city is forced to fight not only against external enemies, but against its own soldiers. The mercenaries, once the proud defenders of Carthage's wealth, are now its executioners. Carthage has no soldiers left to trust. When the dust settles, Carthage is shattered. The damage isn't just military, it's psychological. The city's reputation as an unshakable powerhouse is broken. In the aftermath of the Mercenary War, Carthage realizes the hollow nature of its empire. The empire that seemed invincible was built on sand, and when the tide of war turned, that sand washed away. The defeat is more than just a military loss. It reveals Carthage's true vulnerability. No empire can survive without loyalty, and no empire can rely solely on gold to maintain its power. Carthage's downfall wasn't caused by outside forces, it was self-inflicted. The empire's greed for gold and expansion blinded its rulers to the true cost of empire: loyalty, sacrifice, and unity. Mercenaries fought for Carthage, but they were never part of it. In the end, the gold that fueled Carthage's rise also fueled its destruction. The philosophical gut punch is this: empires built on exploitation and gold are destined to fail. When the gold runs out, so does the loyalty. And when loyalty fades, the empire crumbles. But even as Carthage reels from its own moral failure, another power is quietly watching, learning from Carthage's mistakes. Rome, a rising empire with a different vision of loyalty and unity, is poised to make its move. Carthage's next battle won't just be for survival. It will be against a foe that understands what Carthage failed to. Loyalty cannot be bought, it must be earned. When Carthage signed a treaty with Rome, they thought they were securing peace. What they didn't know is that they were signing the death warrant for their entire empire. It wasn't war that destroyed them, it was the mistake of believing a treaty could outlast their ambition. It's 509 BC. The Carthaginian Empire, flush with wealth from its vast fleets and colonies, sits at the top of the Mediterranean world. Meanwhile, across the sea, a small, scrappy city-state, Rome, is slowly starting to extend its influence. Carthage, in its arrogant confidence, sees Rome as nothing more than a minor nuisance. The treaty between them is nothing more than a diplomatic formality. Mutual respect, they call it. Rome, still a fledgling republic, agrees not to cross the Mediterranean. Carthage, in turn, promises the same. But what neither power realizes is that respect in diplomacy is a mask for eventual dominance, and Rome is already looking ahead. The lie is not just that Carthage misunderstood Rome's intentions, but that they believed Rome's expansion was slow, that their interests were just regional. They couldn't have been more wrong. Rome wasn't interested in keeping the peace. They were interested in growing it, swallowing cities, and expanding its republic one territory at a time. They wanted more, and Carthage, for all its wealth, was just one more conquest waiting to happen. Fast forward to 480 BC. Rome's growing power is beginning to stir the waters. Carthage's interests are still rooted in trade, in merchant alliances, in securing its colonies. Rome, however, has expanded beyond its borders, building an empire on the backs of conquered tribes and cities. Carthage might have a grand fleet, but what's the point of a navy when your enemy controls entire regions of land? Rome has set its eyes on Sicily, a key trade route, a fertile land, a gateway to the rest of the Mediterranean. Carthage is forced to defend it. And thus begins the First Punic War, not just a fight for an island but a test of two very different worldviews. Carthage, a merchant empire, seeks to control the sea, while Rome, a land-based republic, sees itself as a natural expansionist power. They are two empires built on completely different ideologies, and this clash will set them on a path that neither can escape. The First Punic War leaves Carthage broken. Rome, hungry for control, captures Sicily and establishes itself as a Mediterranean power. Carthage's wealth may be immense, but it is now vulnerable, not just to external threats but to its own miscalculations. It wasn't war that undid Carthage. It was a misunderstanding of its position in the world. Empires aren't built on treaties, they're built on ambition. Carthage relied on gold, treaties, and alliances. Rome relied on the promise of power, the absolute necessity of expanding, absorbing, and conquering. Rome didn't care about peace, it cared about Rome. The inevitable truth is this: the greatest empire in history wasn't built on military might alone, it was built on ambition and vision. And Carthage, for all its might, failed because it couldn't see that. The first defeat is just the beginning. Rome's victory has set the stage for an even larger war. And as Carthage picks up the pieces of its shattered empire, Rome's eyes turn toward the heart of Carthage itself, its mother city, its treasures, its people. The real war is about to begin. What do you do when the wolves at your door are wearing sheep's clothing? Carthage believed it had signed a peace treaty with Rome, but what they didn't know was that they were signing a death sentence. It's 500 BC, and the Mediterranean is a world of ever-shifting alliances and emerging powers. Rome, an unassuming city-state on the banks of the Tiber River, begins to take its first steps toward empire. To the south, the mighty Carthage reigns over the seas with its unparalleled navy, dominating trade routes and controlling key territories in Spain, Sicily, and North Africa. Rome at this point isn't a threat to anyone. Carthage's wealth is unrivaled, its armies are feared. But Rome doesn't care about wealth or fear, it cares about control, about expanding its borders and absorbing every piece of land it touches. And as the decades roll by, the two powers, Carthage, an empire of trade and diplomacy, Rome, an empire of expansion and conquest, are on a collision course. But the shocking truth is this: Carthage's downfall wasn't caused by military strength, it was caused by Rome's refusal to acknowledge its own limits. In Rome there is no hesitation, no second guessing. Every step, no matter how small, is part of an insatiable drive for more. Carthage, in its wealth and grandeur, believed peace was a diplomatic game, but Rome was playing chess, while Carthage was still looking at checkers. The lie Carthage told itself was this: Rome will never challenge us. They're just a city-state, no threat. And with this false belief, Carthage allowed its empire to grow fat, complacent, and vulnerable. Rome, by contrast, knew something Carthage didn't. The land was the future. The sea may have been Carthage's kingdom, but Rome knew that to become the greatest power, it needed more than the oceans. Rome understood that territory was the true power, and the first step was securing Sicily. Not because they needed it, but because it was the gateway to Carthage's empire, the start of their master plan. As Rome expands throughout the Italian peninsula, its eyes now turn to Sicily, a crucial island that acts as a bridge between east and west. To Carthage, Sicily has always been within its grasp. Its ships sail these waters, its colonies line the coast, and its wealth flows from this territory. But Rome isn't just interested in controlling Sicily, it's after something much more dangerous. Rome is preparing for total domination. They don't care if they sign a treaty with Carthage. The treaty is not a contract of peace, it's a temporary delay. Rome will play the part of the humble partner, but behind closed doors they are already planning their next move. The Carthaginian rulers, meanwhile, remain obsessed with their wealth. They believe Rome is beneath them, a minor inconvenience on the world stage. They will learn too late that Rome is no minor player. By 264 BC, Rome's eyes have turned to Sicily, and Carthage, unable to see the storm coming, is about to lose it all. The truth is simple and brutal. Rome wasn't just expanding, it was strategically eliminating every threat to its power. What Carthage sees as a minor inconvenience, a skirmish in Sicily, is actually a prelude to its undoing. But the disturbing truth goes deeper. The treaty between Carthage and Rome wasn't a pact, it was a power play. Rome was already laying the groundwork for a new kind of war, one that Carthage never saw coming. They would win battles, sure, but Rome knew that to win the war, it needed to control the land. The consequences of Carthage's ignorance were devastating. Rome, having steadily chipped away at the balance of power, forces Carthage into the First Punic War. The war drags on, and Carthage, once proud and untouchable, is finally crushed on the battlefield. But the true cost of Rome's expansion is not just the loss of Sicily, it is the loss of Carthage's identity. The world that Carthage once ruled from the seas is slipping through its fingers. The merchant empire is now forced into military conflict, fighting for its very survival. The traders who once ruled the Mediterranean now face an opponent with a ruthless vision of total dominance, and the price they pay will be astronomical. And here lies the gut punch. Carthage's failure wasn't in its military might, its trade routes, or its wealth. It was in its inability to adapt to a world that no longer cared about trade or diplomacy. Empires built on commerce and trade can no longer survive when the world shifts to war and territory. Carthage built its power on trade and mutual respect, but Rome built its power on conquest and relentless expansion. As the dust settles from the First Punic War, Rome has secured Sicily, and Carthage is left broken, its wealth drained. But this is only the beginning. Rome is no longer the city-state that can be ignored, it is now an empire with a relentless drive. Carthage's next move will determine whether they can recover, or whether they will be consumed. The flames of war are only just beginning to burn, and the next Punic War will burn hotter than the first. Imagine being the most powerful empire in the Mediterranean, your navy unmatched, your wealth limitless, and yet, on the horizon, a humble, fledgling republic from the Tiber River begins to loom, and it's coming for everything you hold dear. It's 264 BC. The Mediterranean is on the edge of change, and at its center, two powers are about to collide in a battle that will reshape the ancient world forever. Carthage, the great merchant empire with its legendary navy, a city built from the sea, cultural magnificence, and an economy built on trade and diplomacy. Across the sea, Rome, still a republic at this time, with a small yet growing military and political influence, is turning its gaze toward Sicily. To Carthage, it's just another trading post, a jewel in its empire, but to Rome, it's the keystone of future power. The first clashes between these two powers seem almost absurd. Carthage, the master of the seas with its experience, fleets, and gold versus Rome, a land-based republic with no real naval experience. But here's the thing, Rome has no business winning this war. And yet they will. Oh. Not because of better ships, better soldiers, or better resources, but because Rome was willing to do whatever it took. And Carthage, with all its grandeur, could not adapt. Carthage believed, without question, that Rome's military would collapse under the weight of Carthaginian naval supremacy. The lie Carthage told itself was this: we control the sea. Rome is landlocked. How could they possibly defeat us? But this is where Carthage's fatal flaw lies. It underestimates Rome's ambition, and it never considered that Rome would re-engineer warfare itself to survive. The Romans weren't playing the same game, they were inventing a new one, and they didn't need a navy to fight on their terms. At first, Carthage's navy strikes fear into Roman hearts. The early battles are a bloodbath, and Rome is on the brink of collapse. Carthage controls the seas, its ships expertly maneuvering, decimating Roman forces. But Rome isn't finished. In fact, it's just beginning. Rome turns to innovation, a game-changing invention, the corvus. This boarding device, which lets Roman soldiers board Carthaginian ships, turns the tide of war. Rome's lack of naval experience no longer matters. They've changed the nature of the fight, using their superior engineering, their citizen soldiers, and the willingness to innovate at any cost. Rome takes Carthage's strength and turns it into a weakness. Now comes the real disaster for Carthage. It's not the naval battles they lose, it's the internal rot of their empire. Carthage relies on mercenaries, soldiers for hire, not passionate defenders of a cause. Mercenaries fight for money, not honor. And this introduces chaos into Carthage's military system. At the heart of their empire, loyalty isn't a given, it's transactional. Carthage's elite merchant families rely on mercenaries because they view war as a business, not a cause worth dying for. Rome, by contrast, fights for survival. Carthage's tactical advantage slowly slips away as the mercenaries' loyalty begins to wane. Their strategy fails because Carthage can't even hold together its own fighting force. As Rome advances, the consequences of Carthage's mistakes become clear. The great Carthaginian Empire begins to unravel, not from military defeat alone, but from internal divisions, mercenary rebellions, and a military system that can no longer keep up. This failure to adapt to an unexpected kind of war means Carthage's greatest assets, its wealth, its control of the seas, are no longer enough. Rome's determination, unity, and innovative strategies lead them to victory. And when Carthage's fleet is defeated, it isn't just the sea that is lost, it's the very heart of their empire. Carthage's wealth can't buy them victory, and their navy can't win the war. The gut punch is this: Carthage failed not because of Rome's superior force, but because Rome knew how to fight with a unified, relentless spirit. The defeat isn't just military, it's a deep failure of philosophy. Rome seized the Mediterranean because it wanted it. Carthage held on to the Mediterranean because it didn't know how to let go of what it thought it owned. The real cost of empire isn't wealth, it isn't ships or soldiers. It's the willingness to change, to adapt to new realities. Empires that fail to evolve lose their place in history, no matter how much wealth they have. But the battle for Sicily is just the first act. With the Roman victory secured, the question now is, how will Carthage recover? Is there a future for this empire, or has its time already passed? Rome's expansion has only just begun, and it is far from satisfied. The true war, the one that will determine the fate of the Mediterranean, is still to come. Carthage will have one more chance to hold on to its glory, but at what cost? If you've been following along, you already know that what happens next will change the course of history. But we're just scratching the surface. This is where the stakes get even higher, where the power of empires is tested, and the true cost of ambition is revealed. Don't miss what comes next. Subscribe, like, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a moment of this epic story. And thank you for sticking with us through this incredible journey so far. You've witnessed the beginning of a transformation that will shake the Mediterranean. But trust me, what's coming next is going to be even more shocking. Stay tuned because the best is yet to come. In 241 BC, Carthage didn't just lose a war, they lost their soul. Rome's victory in the First Punic War shattered Carthage's dominance. But even more devastating was how it exposed the heart of Carthage's biggest flaw. They were never prepared for the rise of a new empire built on resilience, not riches. The Mediterranean was changing, and it wasn't just about geography, it was about a new kind of power rising from the ashes of old systems. Carthage, a civilization that had commanded the seas for centuries, was now facing a new enemy, one that fought with endless resolve and strategic innovation, and that enemy was Rome. On one side, Hamilcar Barca, a genius of war, his every move carefully calculated, his ambition threatening to outpace even Carthage's great wealth. On the other, Publius Cornelius Scipio, the unrelenting Roman general who would rise from a city that believed in total conquest. Carthage's naval supremacy was the bedrock of its empire. They were untouchable at sea, dominating trade routes from the Atlantic to the Aegean. But it wasn't just military might they relied on, it was an empire built on wealth, trade, and mercenaries. They thought they could buy their way to victory, but Rome saw something they didn't, an opportunity to change the rules of the game. The tide turned in 241 BC, when Carthage's last chance at victory in the naval clash at the Battle of the Aegates Islands ended in total defeat. With Rome victorious, they not only captured Sicily but shattered the myth of Carthaginian invincibility. What followed wasn't just the loss of land, it was the loss of Carthage's identity as a dominant Mediterranean power. Rome now controlled Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. But the true loss wasn't just territory, it was Carthage's soul, exposed for the world to see. Carthage had relied too much on mercenaries and now they were left with nothing. The city would have to rebuild, but could it? Carthage told itself that money and trade could buy victory. The merchant oligarchy believed they could strike deals, bribe their enemies, and use their vast wealth to continue their influence over the Mediterranean. They thought their naval supremacy would always be enough to control the seas. But the truth was, Carthage couldn't see past its own wealth. The lie they told themselves was that they were invincible, untouchable. Their victory in commerce would ensure their dominance, but they missed something critical. Rome didn't play by those rules. Rome's resilience was born from unity, sacrifice, and a sense of destiny, a force that no amount of wealth could ever buy. As Rome's fleet grew, Carthage's navy began to rot. Their ships were built for trade, not battle. They depended on mercenaries, fighters who were paid to fight, but didn't have the same loyalty or motivation as Rome's soldiers. The political factions within Carthage made the situation worse. The merchant class refused to take the military seriously, too consumed with profits to see the larger threat. Carthage's inability to adapt, to see that victory was no longer about wealth alone, was their undoing. Rome, on the other hand, learned from every defeat. They adapted, building a fleet, outmaneuvering Carthage's greatest strength, and relying on the endless resolve of citizen soldiers. Rome didn't just fight for land, they fought for dominion. And that would prove to be their greatest weapon. The First Punic War's aftermath was crippling for Carthage. The city's naval fleet was decimated, and Rome's rise as the dominant naval power was unchallenged. Carthage was now left to rebuild, but could they? The internal fractures and the fractured mercenary system left them vulnerable. Meanwhile, Rome's transformation into an imperial force was swift and absolute. The defeat of Carthage marked the end of an era, and the beginning of Rome's dominance. Carthage was a shadow of its former self, stripped of its land, its navy, and its pride. The long-term effects of the defeat would haunt Carthage for centuries, as they faced the rise of a new empire, one that would soon become the greatest power the world had ever seen. But here's the real truth, the gut punch. Carthage's failure wasn't just about military defeat, it was about failure to change. They were too blinded by their own success, by their wealth and trade. Rome's ultimate victory wasn't about military superiority, it was about an unyielding spirit and the willingness to evolve. Rome didn't rely on riches to secure their future. They relied on vision and the power of will. Carthage? They trusted their riches too much and their will too little. In the end, Carthage's blindness to Rome's resolve, to the dangers of their own political infighting, and their over-reliance on mercenaries turned a proud empire into an afterthought. Rome, on the other hand, became the new center of power, a city that would dominate the world for centuries. But this is far from the end for Carthage. Rome may have won Sicily, but the true war is just beginning. Stay tuned as we explore the aftershocks of this war, the rebirth of Carthage, and how Rome's new ambitions will bring about a brutal, world-changing conflict. Because Carthage won't go down without a fight. But at what cost? Hannibal Barca, one of the greatest military minds to ever live, led an army that crossed the Alps and devastated Roman legions. But what most don't know is that the real enemy was never Rome, it was Carthage itself. The year is 218 BC. Rome, the beast of the Mediterranean, had seen its fortunes rise to untold heights. Carthage, defeated and humiliated in the First Punic War, should have been a shadow of its former self. But then came Hamilcar Barca, and from the ashes of Carthage's defeat, he began rebuilding, not just an army, but a philosophy of warfare that would bring his son Hannibal into the fold. Hannibal, born from the embers of defeat, swore to never forgive Rome for their role in Carthage's downfall. His journey, though, would soon reveal something far more damning. Rome wasn't the problem, Carthage's failure to support its own military genius was. In 218 BC, Hannibal set out to prove a simple truth. that an empire isn't defined by its military power, but by its capacity to sustain its warriors. Crossing the Alps wasn't just a remarkable feat, it was an insult to Rome's self-proclaimed superiority. But Rome didn't collapse, did it? Instead, they adapted, quickly realizing that their most powerful weapon wasn't their military, but their ability to replenish and regroup, something Hannibal would soon lack. For centuries, Rome's mythology painted them as the invincible empire, their success not just the result of military conquest, but of the divine favor they believed guided them. Carthage, once their most potent adversary, had been crushed and left in ruins. But what if the truth is far more shocking? Rome wasn't as invincible as they wanted to believe. It was Carthage's fractured politics and internal corruption that allowed Rome to survive and grow, even when faced with one of the greatest military leaders of the ancient world. Rome adapted. Carthage failed. As Hannibal marched through Italy, crushing the Roman legions, what was Rome doing? They were bleeding but also building. The very forces that should have collapsed the Roman system were met with a well-oiled machine of resilience, built not only on military strength but on organizational and cultural tenacity. Meanwhile, Hannibal's victories, Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae, led to nothing lasting. Why? Because Carthage's resources dried up. Hannibal, left isolated by his own city's inability to supply and support him, was forced to fight a war of attrition against an empire that learned from its own defeats. But here's the shocker. Carthage's greatest weakness wasn't Rome's strength, but the failure of its own leadership to adapt. The truth? Hannibal wasn't fighting for Carthage, he was fighting alone. While Hannibal's campaign in Italy was one of the greatest military feats in history, it was also one of the greatest failures of support. Carthage's inability to sustain its general and his army would eventually lead to Hannibal's downfall. His successes were undermined by Carthage's own internal corruption, leaving him to face an opponent that adapted and grew stronger with every loss. Rome, on the other hand, learned from their mistakes. They could adapt, rebuild, and regenerate their military machine faster than Hannibal could make progress. And that's where the tragedy of Hannibal lies, not in his defeats, but in the failure of Carthage to support him. He was an extraordinary general, fighting for a lost cause, a cause that was abandoned by his own people, shackled by their inability to evolve. The legacy of Carthage wasn't just its fall, it was its inability to recognize that the future of empires isn't just about military brilliance. It's about a society's ability to support that brilliance. Carthage's failure to nourish Hannibal's genius was the ultimate betrayal. And this, ultimately, is the real story behind Rome's rise. Not just their victory but the fact that they learned while Carthage could not. As Hannibal's forces began to wane, Rome, the seemingly indestructible empire, would turn the tables. But the war was far from over. In the shadows of battle, a new player was rising, and this twist would change everything. How far would Hannibal go, and could he defy fate once more? Stay tuned, because the real test of Carthage's heart and Rome's resolve is yet to come. The greatest military strategist of his time, a man who humbled the mighty Roman legions, didn't lose because his plans failed. He lost because the very empire he fought for couldn't stand behind him. This is the tragic story of Hannibal Barca's genius, and its ultimate betrayal. The year is 216 BC. Rome, in the wake of its early victories, believes it is the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. The Second Punic War, a conflict born from humiliation and revenge, is unfolding. But in the heart of Carthage there is one man who could turn the tide. His name? Hannibal Barca. This isn't a story of Rome's expansion, but a story of its fallibility and the arrogance that would blind it to the threat posed by one of the greatest military minds the world has ever seen. Hannibal, born in the shadow of Rome's crushing defeat of Carthage in the First Punic War, vowed to make them pay for the destruction of his homeland. Armed with a deep-seated hatred and unmatched tactical genius, he led his forces on a path of destruction, striking deep into the heart of Italy. But this story isn't just about military victories, it's about the fatal flaw of the empire he represented. In Trebia and Lake Trasimene, Hannibal's military brilliance was undeniable. He made Rome look like amateurs, trapped in a deadly game of cat and mouse. But the real shock was at Cannae, where he executed a double envelopment that would become a textbook case for generations to come. But here's the kicker. Why did these brilliant victories not translate into ultimate success for Carthage? The answer is one that will change everything you think you know about Hannibal's campaign, and about Rome itself. For years, history has painted a picture of Hannibal as the undefeated genius and Rome as the invincible empire. We've been led to believe that Rome's strength was in its military, in its legions. But the truth is much darker. The real reason Hannibal failed wasn't because Rome was stronger. It was because Rome understood something fundamental that Carthage never did. Rome was a merciless empire of will, while Carthage was a fractured republic, paralyzed by its political divisions. The myth that Hannibal could have defeated Rome if only Carthage had supported him? It's not just a lie. It's a dangerous distortion of history that makes us ignore Rome's ruthless adaptability. Hannibal fought Rome on their terms, but he couldn't win against an empire that was built to never back down, no matter the cost. Carthage's delusional sense of honor, its lack of centralized power, and its internal corruption ensured that even victories as grand as Cannae couldn't turn the tide. Let's talk about Trebia, where Hannibal's first blow to Rome came. The Romans, confident in their strength, were led into an ambush by Hannibal. It was a textbook trap. The Romans, overconfident and unprepared, lost 30,000 men. But the real devastation wasn't the loss of life, it was the loss of Rome's moral high ground. For the first time, Rome had been humiliated, and it was a wound that would fester for the next several years. But it didn't stop there. At Lake Trasimene, Hannibal perfected his craft. A surprise attack. The Romans thought they had the upper hand, but Hannibal used the terrain to his advantage, luring them into a narrow valley and destroying them. Over 15,000 Romans were slaughtered, and the shockwaves went through the Roman Senate. How had their invincible army been decimated twice? Then came Cannae, the crowning jewel of Hannibal's career. The double envelopment, a tactic so brilliant it was taught in every military academy for centuries to come. The Roman legions, completely encircled, were massacred. 75,000 men were lost in a single day. Rome was shattered, its legions in ruins, its pride crushed. And yet, Rome didn't collapse. Why? Because the Romans didn't see defeat as the end. They saw it as an opportunity to adapt, regroup, and strike back harder. Carthage, on the other hand, was paralyzed, unable to act decisively. What followed was a cycle of Carthaginian brilliance, followed by Rome's brutal resilience. Hannibal, with his army cut off from supplies, reinforcements, and support, could not continue his decisive push into Italy. He relied on mercenaries, a fragmented force with no lasting allegiance to Carthage. And here's where it all falls apart. Carthage failed to provide the infrastructure Hannibal needed to sustain his brilliant victories. The lack of central power in Carthage doomed its military efforts. even though Hannibal proved himself time and again as a tactical genius. Rome meanwhile began rebuilding. After Cannae they didn't cower, they adapted. They shifted from direct confrontation to attrition, slowly but surely wearing down Hannibal's forces. Their ability to rebuild their legions and adapt their strategies would ultimately crush Hannibal's hopes. In the end, Hannibal's brilliance could only take him so far. It wasn't his failure as a general, but Carthage's failure as a state, that sealed his defeat. The true tragedy is not in the bloodshed of battle, but in the failure of Carthage's political system, a system that refused to adapt and support its own generals. Hannibal's victory was in fact his downfall. He fought with brilliant tactics, but against an empire that learned from its mistakes and never stopped evolving. Rome's strength was in its ability to endure, not in its immediate victory. What's worse, Carthage's legacy wasn't just in its downfall, it was in what it could have been. Had it supported its commanders, had it been willing to evolve like Rome, perhaps the Mediterranean would have been a very different place. Instead, Hannibal's brilliance and the brilliance of Carthage was crushed by a lack of support and vision. Rome's recovery was inevitable, but could it hold on to its inexorable rise? The final, decisive clash between these two empires loomed on the horizon. Carthage might have lost, but Hannibal's story wasn't over yet. Could he, against all odds, rally for one last stand? Or would the legacy of Carthage, the great empire that never was, be doomed to fade away? Stay tuned for the final battle that would forever define the course of history. When Rome stood on the precipice of annihilation, it wasn't the strength of its legions that saved it. It was the unthinkable choice to bow down, to swallow its pride, and do nothing. But that decision didn't just save Rome, it doomed everything it once believed. It's 216 BC. The greatest defeat in Roman history has just occurred. 80,000 Roman soldiers, entire legions, lie dead on the battlefield of Cannae, where Hannibal, a foreign general, crushed them with tactics that stunned the world. Rome, invincible to all who had come before, now faces extinction. Its enemies wait for the final blow, as Hannibal roams free on Roman soil. But what happens next is not a counteroffensive, not a revenge campaign, but an unprecedented act of self-doubt. Rome does the unthinkable, it chooses not to fight. It chooses survival through inaction. Rome's Senate is torn, their pride crushed, their military genius shattered. In the midst of this, Quintus Fabius Maximus emerges, a general with a reputation for caution, a man with a plan so radically un-Roman it shocks even his allies. Fabius refuses to engage Hannibal head-on. He doesn't rally the legions to charge the Carthaginian leader. Instead, he abandons the pursuit. His troops do nothing. He teaches his people a shocking lesson. Survival isn't about overpowering your enemy, but about waiting for him to overreach. Hannibal's pride, his belief in victory, becomes his weakness. But the rest of Rome is outraged. They want war. They want to avenge their fallen men. They want to restore the Roman glory. Instead, Fabius makes them wait, and with it, he seals the future of Rome. The myth we've been told for centuries is simple. Rome is invincible because of its legions, its gods, its might. But Rome didn't win by sheer military prowess. It won by enduring humiliation. Fabius didn't fight to win. He fought to survive. And his greatest triumph was not victory on the battlefield, but his ability to teach Rome how to endure defeat. He didn't restore Roman pride. He taught them that pride itself might destroy them. And so, what does this victory cost? Rome wins, yes, but it does so at the expense of its soul. The Roman spirit, the invincible will that had once driven it to the top, had been replaced with something new, a mechanical, calculated survival. The Roman identity was never the same after this war. What happens when an empire survives, but at the cost of its very essence? This isn't just a military adaptation, it's a cultural shift. The Romans, once proud conquerors, have learned the hard lesson that in order to survive, they must redefine what it means to be Roman. As the smoke cleared from the ashes of Cannae, Rome didn't just rebuild its armies, it rebuilt itself, slowly and deliberately. But the true cost is hidden in the silence between the victories. The Roman soul was wounded beyond repair, and as the legions grew stronger, the people grew cold. Rome may have won, but it was no longer Rome. And the city that had once conquered the world was now forced to question what it stood for. When Fabius decided not to fight, he didn't just save Rome, he changed it forever. He showed Rome how to survive, but in doing so, he made them question whether survival was worth the loss of everything they once were. The true victory wasn't in military tactics, but in the willingness to sacrifice pride. But at what cost? In the end, Rome never regained the invincibility it once held, and its survival became a shadow of the empire it could have been. But was Fabius' survival strategy truly the answer? Or did it set the stage for Rome's ultimate moral decay? What happens when a nation sacrifices its identity for its survival? As we move toward the ultimate clash at Zama, the question remains, can Rome ever fully recover from the choices it made during the darkest days of its existence? The greatest general the ancient world ever saw, a man who shattered every Roman expectation, was destroyed not by his enemies, but by a civilization's unrelenting need for conquest. His name was Hannibal Barca. And his defeat at Zama wasn't just a loss, it was the death of a dream. 202 BC, the Mediterranean teeters on the brink of transformation. Carthage, once a colossal naval power, is now at its weakest, and its greatest champion, Hannibal, has fought through 2 decades of war to bring Rome to its knees. Yet, despite Hannibal's military brilliance, a question hangs in the air. Can even the most brilliant minds survive in a world where history demands more than just victory? Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general who crossed the Alps with a war machine of elephants and mercenaries. Scipio Africanus, Rome's most cunning general, the reluctant savior who would rise out of the ashes of a crumbling empire. And the Carthaginian elite, a class of merchants and generals too focused on their own egos to realize what was at stake. Hannibal had destroyed Rome on their own soil. At Cannae, he orchestrated a victory that would echo through the ages. His genius was a weapon that sliced through the Roman legions with surgical precision. But victory was never enough. In the battle for Rome's heart, Hannibal's brilliance began to feel like a curse. He'd become a prisoner of his own strategy, chained to the belief that the battle was still about land and tactics when Rome was transforming into something altogether different. An empire not bound by territory but by the sheer will to survive. Rome's defeat was imminent, or so it seemed. For years, Hannibal played the role of Rome's nemesis, outwitting their greatest generals. But even as he moved toward his final triumph, Hannibal failed to see that the true weapon Rome possessed wasn't just its armies. It was its resilience. And in this moment, the greatest mind of the ancient world was being undone not by battle, but by time. Rome's survival instinct was rising, and it would take nothing less than the fall of Hannibal to prove it. The myth of Carthage's unbreakable power had been shattered by years of relentless war. But there was another lie, that Hannibal's war was doomed from the start. We look at his defeats and label them as inevitable: too much reliance on mercenaries, too much ambition. The truth? Hannibal never failed because he wasn't brilliant. He failed because Carthage wasn't built to survive. The failure of Carthage wasn't in its soldiers, it was in its soul. The Carthaginian elite had built an empire on commerce, on clever trade deals, and an unbending loyalty to profit. But Rome's genius was never in its riches, it was in its resilience. And as the world watched, Carthage's refusal to adapt led to its downfall. They could not see beyond their mercenary-based tactics, failing to realize that victory was never about the battle, it was about who could hold their moral ground the longest. Carthage's internal fractures were its undoing. The elite, divided between mercantile interests and military ambition, were blind to the future. Hannibal's victory came at a great personal cost, but his real battle lay in convincing a fragmented government to unite for one last stand. Carthage's own leaders, who had once marched into battle with their armies, were now squabbling over who would lead the charge. Was it their wealth that defined them or their soldiers' loyalty? While Hannibal prepared for the final clash, Rome was quietly rebuilding its strength. What Carthage couldn't understand was that Rome had already fought its real battle, the battle for its soul. Scipio Africanus, once thought of as a mere footnote in Rome's struggle, had quietly learned from the greatest mind of the age. His genius lay not in conquering the land, but in outlasting Carthage's internal collapse. The Battle of Zama wasn't just a military battle, it was the collapse of everything Hannibal had fought for. And Rome didn't just win, they redefined what it meant to be an empire. Zama would become the final chapter in the rise of a new Roman world. A world where resilience, not brilliance, would define victory. Hannibal's defeat signaled the fall of Carthage, but it was also the death of an era that valued innovation over sheer survival. The Carthaginian way would no longer be an alternative. Rome's way was now the only way. And in this stark, chilling truth, we see that Rome's greatest victory was the death of choice. After the victory at Zama, Carthage didn't just lose land. It lost its identity. The terms of peace, crippling reparations, loss of naval supremacy, and the forced surrender of its military power, ensured that Carthage would never return to its former glory. But the real cost of that defeat? The elimination of a vision of empire based on commerce and mutual benefit, a vision that had once rivaled Rome's ambition. Carthage's dream of diversity, of a world where power was built on cooperation and innovation, was wiped out. What Rome's victory truly cost wasn't just the land, but the freedom to think differently about power. Rome's victory was complete, but what did it truly achieve? A world more unified, yes, but also a world less diverse. The Mediterranean would never see another Carthage again, a city driven not by the sword, but by the trade winds and the spirit of the merchant. And in that silence, we hear the ghost of a civilization whose fate was sealed, not by military force, but by the very structure of their own society. The fall of Carthage wasn't just a battle won, it was the beginning of a new world order where power would no longer be a conversation, but a monologue. Carthage must be destroyed. This cry echoed not out of righteousness, but out of a profound Roman fear, one born not of victory but of insecurity. What was Rome so afraid of? Why destroy a city that was already defeated, already weakened, already struggling to survive? The answer lies in a truth historians rarely speak aloud. Rome killed Carthage because Carthage posed an existential threat to the very soul of Roman identity. 149 BC, Rome has ascended to the peak of Mediterranean power. The Punic Wars are over, but the Roman elite, led by men like Cato the Elder, fear a rival that still breathes, Carthage. It is not just the loss of territory that shakes Rome, it's the threat of Carthage's return to dominance, especially in the economic and trade sectors. Carthage was destroyed to end a threat. That's the common line. But Rome didn't fear military conquest. They feared Carthage's economic resilience. Carthage was still a trading hub, a city of merchants, skilled engineers, and diplomats who could rebuild their empire with one stroke of economic genius. Carthage wasn't just a city, it was a philosophy, a vision of the Mediterranean where Rome's control wasn't absolute. And that vision couldn't be allowed to survive. Cato the Elder's obsession wasn't just with military defeat, it was with erasing a competing worldview. Roman identity was built on military conquest, discipline, and power. The economic dominance of Carthage, with its maritime expertise, threatened to show that trade and diplomacy could build a better empire than sheer militarism. Cato knew that if Carthage survived, it might one day rise again and challenge Rome's dominance over the Mediterranean. The end of Carthage was never about defeating an enemy, it was about silencing a vision of empire that Rome could never accept. The siege of Carthage wasn't just a military action, it was the systematic destruction of a vision of society. In its final years, Carthage was recovering from its previous wars. Wealth was flowing back into the city, its merchants growing stronger. By 149 BC, Carthage had rebuilt its walls, regained its trade dominance, and was expanding its influence once again, facing no real military threat from Rome. But Rome couldn't afford to let that happen. It couldn't just defeat Carthage militarily, it needed to erase Carthage's potential for resurgence. The final siege wasn't an attempt to conquer, it was an attempt to obliterate every trace of Carthaginian identity. The Romans built their siege carefully, intentionally, as a lesson to any future challengers of Rome's dominance. And even after Carthage's defenses fell, the city was destroyed beyond recognition. Its temples were plundered, its people enslaved, and its very foundations desecrated. Rome didn't just conquer, it made sure there would be no memory left of the enemy it had feared. Historians love to tell us that Carthage's destruction was the inevitable consequence of its military defeat, but this view is incomplete. The true story isn't just one of war, it's one of fear, politics, and cultural erasure. When Carthage was destroyed, it wasn't just an end of military power, it was the end of a competing vision of empire. Rome's victory, ultimately, was a victory of cultural and political erasure. Carthage was wiped from the earth because it was an idea that threatened Rome's future, not just a city to conquer. The final destruction of Carthage wasn't a moment of celebration for the Roman people. It was the birth of a new Roman identity. This was an empire born from military strength, but now dominated by fear, the fear that one day a competitor like Carthage might rise again. The price Rome paid for this victory was high, the loss of a different model of Mediterranean power, a model based not on conquest but on diplomacy, trade, and commercial collaboration. What does it say about a civilization that must destroy all other examples of success to ensure its survival? It speaks to the fragility of that empire, a fragility hidden beneath a facade of strength. It says that even the most powerful empire in history can be built on fear and the destruction of alternatives. Rome's real victory was never in the battlefields. It was in the total erasure of the competition. As the flames of Carthage turned to ash, The Romans were left with a powerful empire, but one built on the fragility of fear. Rome destroyed Carthage not just as a city but as an idea, the idea that there could be another way to build an empire. What Rome created was an empire that stood in opposition to everything Carthage represented. But the true cost of this victory? It left the Roman Empire with only one path to follow: military conquest. Carthage's destruction sealed Rome's future, not as a diversified empire, but as a machine of war, a society that would expand through brutality and assimilation, rather than diplomacy or cooperation. Rome's greatest victory became its greatest loss. Carthage didn't just burn, it was annihilated not just by Rome's might, but by something more insidious: its own system of empire building. It's 146 BCE, and as Rome crushes Carthage, they don't just defeat an enemy, they erase a rival idea. For over a century, Carthage stood as Rome's economic equal. But Rome was not simply fighting for dominance. It was fighting for an empire of ideals, one that would dominate the Mediterranean through brute force and cultural conformity, not the dynamic trade networks that had made Carthage so powerful. Carthage was built not on conquest but on commerce, and Rome's victory was not about military prowess, it was about Rome's fear of economic power that could rival its own. And that fear led to a deliberate obliteration of not just the city, but everything Carthage stood for. But here's the real truth. Rome didn't destroy Carthage because it was a military threat. It was because Carthage could have been Rome's future rival in a world of shifting economic powers. Rome's destruction of Carthage is often told as a moral victory, a triumph of civilization over the barbaric city. But the truth? Carthage was too much of a threat in other ways. It wasn't just about an army facing a larger one. Rome could crush Carthage's forces, but what they couldn't match was Carthage's trade network, which stretched across the Mediterranean from the fertile lands of Spain to the ivory coasts of Africa. The economy of Carthage was an ecosystem, built on trade, diplomacy, and mutual benefit. The real danger was that Carthage could create a rival Mediterranean economy, one where Rome wasn't the central player. The lie we've been told is that Carthage fell because of Roman military superiority. But that's not true. The reality is Carthage was outwitted economically, and that was more dangerous to Rome than any military threat. To understand why Carthage was destroyed, we need to look at Rome's strategic vision, one that was built on military might, but crumbled without economic dominance. Rome was not only facing Carthage's military, it was confronting an alternative model of empire that relied on trade, innovation, and cultural exchange. The Romans, deeply threatened by Carthage's rising economic power, could not allow such an empire to thrive. In Rome's eyes, Carthage's dominance in the Mediterranean trade routes was a direct challenge to their expansionist plans. This wasn't just an act of war, it was about establishing a unilateral dominance over the sea. When the Romans salted Carthage's earth, they weren't just ensuring Carthage couldn't return, they were ensuring that no one else could take Carthage's place. Here lies the ultimate irony of Carthage's destruction. In eradicating their rival, Rome built an empire that lacked the economic diversity Carthage had mastered. The military might Rome possessed was unquestioned, but the economic sustainability that Carthage offered was gone. By destroying Carthage, Rome inadvertently created an empire of conquest, one that relied on military expansion rather than commercial sustainability. In essence, Rome traded long-term prosperity for short-term dominance. And as history would later reveal, this relentless expansion would be Rome's undoing. What Carthage left behind was not just ruins, it was the blueprint for a truly sustainable empire, one built on trade, adaptability, and diplomacy. It's the true irony of history. Rome's dominance would eventually crumble, not from military defeat, but from the same economic principles that Carthage had perfected. Carthage's destruction was not just the end of a city, it was the end of an era where alternative forms of empire could exist, one where economic power, not military conquest, was the cornerstone of civilization. In Rome's quest for domination, it eradicated not just a rival, but a vision of what the world could have been. Carthage's destruction was the death of diversity in empire building, and Rome's legacy would forever carry the cost of a unilateral, imperial path that could not adapt to the changing world. The question we must ask ourselves is this: in the pursuit of power, what did Rome destroy in the ashes of Carthage? Could the Mediterranean have been better had Carthage lived? The fall of Carthage is often celebrated as the triumph of Rome, but what if that victory was the very thing that stunted Rome's growth in the long run? What we have left is not just a city in ruins, but a stark reminder. The greatest power often fears what it cannot control, and sometimes that fear leads to the death of progress. Rome thought it had destroyed Carthage. But what if the true destruction was Carthage's gift to Rome? The year is 146 BCE. Rome, a burgeoning republic that had tasted the thrill of conquest, stands victorious, its armies in the streets of Carthage, the heart of the once great Punic Empire, now a pile of ash. The soldiers, led by Scipio Aemilianus, burn the city's temples and scatter the streets with salt, vowing to destroy everything that Carthage stood for. But here's the truth no one tells you: Carthage never died. Not in the way you think. Rome's victory over Carthage, the empire they believed to be crushed, extinguished, was in fact the beginning of a slow, quiet death for Rome itself. As Rome celebrates its victory, something shifts in the shadows. Carthage's merchants, the survivors who once thrived on trade routes, quietly rebuild in the ruins of their old empire. But this isn't about buildings or armies anymore. It's about ideas Carthage had that Rome was too blind to see. And those ideas? They were about to suffocate Rome. Rome destroyed Carthage's cities, its leaders, and its military might. But what they couldn't destroy, what they couldn't even see, was Carthage's true power. Rome believed that by erasing Carthage's army, they had snuffed out the Punic threat. The lie they told themselves was simple: Carthage's destruction meant Rome's dominance was assured. But here's the disturbing truth no historian dares to whisper: Rome was built on Carthage's backbone. The lies Rome told itself about its victory were the very chains that would bind it to its own decline. Let's travel back, before the salted earth and burning cities. Carthage had done something Rome never understood. It thrived by building networks. Trade was its power, not land. The finest warships, the sharpest minds, the most valuable goods. Everything flowed through Carthaginian merchants, and they controlled it all. Rome was a city of soldiers, but soldiers need resources. And where did those resources come from? From the remnants of Carthage's trade networks, the very thing they had destroyed. So how could Rome, an empire built on conquest and military might, ever succeed without the invisible networks Carthage had crafted through commerce? Rome couldn't see it, but Carthage's ghost was already haunting its empire. The remnants of Carthaginian merchants had already woven themselves into the fabric of the Roman economic system. Their methods, their tools, their strategies, they had infiltrated Rome's very bones. As Rome expanded, it grew fat, But the empires it conquered were richer in ideas, in trade, in new ways of thinking. Carthage had been wiped off the map, but its systems, its genius, were carried forward into Rome's economic rise. And as Rome grew stronger, it relied more and more on the very networks Carthage had pioneered. But here's the kicker: Rome had no idea. Their blindness to Carthage's influence would sow the seeds for their ultimate downfall. By the time of Rome's golden age, when its armies and legions stretched across the known world, Carthage's legacy was all but forgotten. But Rome's greatest strength, its empire of trade, its roads, its financial systems, had been built by the very merchants Carthage had once sent into exile. It took centuries, but Carthage did not die. It became Rome's unseen puppet master. Rome was so focused on conquering the land that it couldn't see how it had already lost the war in the sea of commerce. And now look around. Rome, for all its military prowess, never learned Carthage's secret. A truly great empire doesn't win through force alone. It builds, it connects, it trades. And Rome would burn just as Carthage did, but for a very different reason. The story of Carthage isn't just about the past, it's about our present and our future. Rome believed it had destroyed its greatest rival, but what it didn't realize is that some victories aren't won on battlefields. Sometimes the most powerful forces are the ones we don't see coming. If this story shook your understanding of history, just wait until you see what we unravel next. The past has more to teach us than we could have ever imagined. Subscribe now and join the journey to uncover hidden truths, untold stories, and lessons that can reshape how we see the world today. Because in the end, the real battle isn't just for land or power, it's for knowledge, and the knowledge we gain shapes the future. Don't miss the next chapter of history, and don't let it slip away.